There are moments in a criminal investigation where everything changes in an instant. Where a single decision, a single miscalculation, a single act of desperation or arrogance collapses weeks of careful concealment into a trail that leads straight to someone's front door. In the case of Nancy Guthrie, that moment came without warning. A phone call was placed. Investigators were already listening. And within a matter of days, federal agents were standing on a doorstep in Southern California with badges, warrants, and answers, though not the answers anyone had been hoping for. The story of that phone call, and what it revealed about the broader investigation into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, is a story about the collision between human desperation and modern surveillance capability. It is a story about the limits of anonymity in a digital age. And it is a story about how a case that began with a missing 84-year-old woman in Tucson, Arizona, has become one of the most complex and deeply watched kidnapping investigations in recent American memory. Nancy Guthrie vanished from her Tucson home sometime in late January. The circumstances of her disappearance were troubling from the beginning. She was elderly. She had a pacemaker. She relied on daily medication. She lived alone. The kind of person whose absence would be noticed quickly, and it was. When family members could not reach her, when she failed to appear for scheduled commitments, when her home showed signs consistent with a forced entry or a hurried departure, law enforcement was called. And the investigation that followed grew rapidly in scope and intensity, driven in part by who her daughter is. Savannah Guthrie, the well-known anchor of NBC's Today Show, is a public figure whose face is recognized across the country. When her mother went missing, the case moved from local news to national attention almost overnight. Within days of Nancy's disappearance being reported, something unusual happened. Ransom notes began arriving. Not at the family's home, not through private channels, but at media outlets. TMZ was among the first to receive one. The note demanded millions of dollars in Bitcoin. It included a specific deadline, 5 o'clock in the morning on a Thursday, just days after the disappearance was made public. It claimed that Nancy was alive, that she was frightened, and that she was aware of the demands being made on her behalf. The note also contained something that immediately distinguished it from a typical hoax. Details. Specific, granular, verifiable details about Nancy Guthrie's property that had never appeared in any media report. One of those details was a floodlight. Not just the existence of a floodlight on the property. Any stranger driving past might notice outdoor lighting, but the specific condition of one of those lights. According to investigative reporting, one of the floodlights in Nancy's backyard was broken, dangling from a wire, visibly damaged. That is not the kind of detail visible from a public street. That is not the kind of detail captured in a satellite image or mentioned in a news broadcast. That is the kind of detail known only to someone who had been on that property, inside that backyard, close enough to see the damage for themselves. Law enforcement took note immediately. The second detail was an Apple Watch. Nancy Guthrie wore one, and the watch was synced to her iPhone, which in turn received data from her pacemaker. This created a network of interconnected devices, a digital ecosystem that tracked her movements, her heart rate, her location, her daily rhythms. The person who wrote the ransom note knew about this ecosystem. They knew that these devices existed, they knew how they functioned, and they appeared to understand that disabling or accounting for them would be necessary to prevent investigators from tracking Nancy's movements in real time. That kind of knowledge does not come from reading a newspaper. It comes from observation. It comes from familiarity. It comes from someone who had either spent time with Nancy Guthrie, spent time inside her home, or had conducted careful reconnaissance of her daily life in preparation for what followed. Federal investigators, specifically the FBI's field office assigned to the case, confirmed through carefully worded public statements that the notes referenced both the floodlight and the Apple Watch. Special Agent in Charge Heath Jan Key acknowledged the significance of these details while deliberately declining to elaborate further. His reasoning was transparent and tactically sound. Every piece of information released publicly becomes a resource for the next person who wants to exploit the investigation. Every detail confirmed gives future hoaxers a template to work from. The FBI was determined not to hand anyone that template, because the hoaxers were already arriving. The volume of false tips, fraudulent ransom demands, and opportunistic intrusions into the Guthrie investigation became a serious problem almost immediately. The FBI reported receiving tens of thousands of tips in the weeks following Nancy's disappearance. Each one had to be logged, reviewed, categorized, and in many cases actively investigated. The vast majority led nowhere. But among the ones that required the most immediate response were the fake ransom communications. The people who, for reasons ranging from financial opportunism to a disturbing desire for attention, decided to insert themselves into a family's worst nightmare. Derek Kella was one of those people. Kella, a man from Torrance, California, was not connected to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance in any way. He had not taken her. He had no information about where she was. He was, by his own admission to federal investigators, someone who had been watching news coverage of the case and had decided to contact the family to see if they would respond. That decision, casual, perhaps even impulsive in his own telling, would cost him enormously. The sequence of events unfolded with remarkable speed. Savannah Guthrie and her siblings released a public video appeal directly to whoever was holding their mother. The appeal was heartfelt and direct. They stated that they were ready to talk, but that they needed proof that their mother was still alive before any meaningful negotiation could take place. The video received widespread coverage. It aired on national news programs. It circulated across social media platforms. Millions of people saw it. Within hours of that video being released, Kella began sending text messages to members of the Guthrie family. Within 3 minutes of sending those texts, he placed a phone call. The call lasted 9 seconds. 9 seconds is not long enough to say much of anything. It is barely enough time to confirm that a connection has been made. But 9 seconds was long enough for investigators who were monitoring incoming communications to the family to begin tracing its origin. Kella had placed the call using a voice-over Internet Protocol service, commonly known as VoIP. VoIP technology allows users to make phone calls through an internet connection rather than through a traditional telephone line. It is widely available, inexpensive, and frequently misunderstood as providing anonymity. Many people assume that routing a call through the internet, through servers that may be located across the country or around the world, makes it impossible to trace. That assumption is dangerously incorrect, particularly when law enforcement is involved. When federal investigators identify a suspicious communication and move to trace it, they do not simply follow the digital signal and arrive at an answer. They engage in a legal process that involves obtaining warrants and subpoenas, compelling cooperation from service providers, coordinating with multiple jurisdictions, and piecing together records that may be spread across several different systems. It takes time. It takes resources. It takes legal authority. In the Guthrie case, investigators had all three. They moved swiftly. They secured what they needed. And the trail that Kella assumed would dissolve into the anonymity of the internet led them, with quiet certainty, to a door in Torrance, California. By the morning after the call was placed, federal agents were already in motion. By the end of the week, Kella was in custody. He was charged with transmitting a ransom demand through interstate communications and with using a telecommunications device to harass. Federal charges. Serious charges. Charges that carry the potential for significant prison time upon conviction. When investigators spoke with Kella, he offered an explanation that was simultaneously mundane and deeply revealing. He said he had wanted to see if the family would respond. That was it. No elaborate scheme. No financial motive he was willing to disclose. Just curiosity, or perhaps a craving for significance, dressed up in the language of someone who had watched a tragedy unfold on television and decided to reach into it with his own hands. The arrest sent a clear message. The FBI is not only searching for the person responsible for Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. It is also running a parallel operation designed to identify, investigate, and prosecute anyone who attempts to exploit the family's pain for personal gain. Every fake ransom demand is pursued. Every fraudulent caller is traced. Every imposter is found. The technology exists to do this, and law enforcement has the will and the legal authority to use it. But the Kella arrest, satisfying as it was from a law enforcement perspective, raised an uncomfortable question that investigators could not escape. If Kella was a fraud, if his call was a hoax and his texts were fabrications, then who sent the notes that contained the details about the floodlight and the Apple Watch? Who knew things that only someone connected to the crime could know? Kella was caught. But the real communicator, the one whose knowledge suggested genuine involvement, remained unidentified. The ransom notes continued to arrive. TMZ reported receiving a second significant demand on February 17, weeks after Nancy's disappearance. This note was described as more sophisticated than the earlier communications. It demanded a different cryptocurrency than the Bitcoin specified in previous notes. It described the consequences of non-payment in graphic and specific terms. And it came from an email address different from the one used previously. For investigators analyzing patterns of communication, these changes were significant. A different cryptocurrency. A different account. A different address. Did this indicate evolution in the kidnapper's approach, an attempt to cover tracks or create confusion? Or did it indicate that a different person entirely had authored this note? Someone who had obtained details from the earlier genuine communications and was now using them as a framework for their own fraud? The FBI was not publicly answering that question. But the consultation they initiated with artificial intelligence experts to analyze the notes linguistically suggested that they were taking it very seriously. Authorship analysis, the science of identifying who wrote a document based on writing patterns, vocabulary choices, sentence structure, grammatical tendencies, and other linguistic markers, has long been a tool in forensic investigation. Every writer has a signature, a set of habits and preferences so deeply ingrained that they persist even when the writer attempts to disguise them. Investigators have used these signatures to identify authors of anonymous letters, threatening communications, and fraudulent documents for decades. But artificial intelligence has complicated this science in ways that are difficult to overstate. A language model, when given the right prompts, can generate text in virtually any style. It can mimic a specific person's known writing patterns. It can produce a ransom note that contains no grammatical errors, no unusual vocabulary choices, no idiosyncrasies that might betray the author's identity. It can, in other words, erase the very signatures that forensic linguists depend on. Former law enforcement professionals consulted in connection with cases like this one have explained that what once gave investigators a clear window into a document's authorship, the small mistakes, the personal verbal tics, the structural habits, can now be scrubbed clean by anyone with access to a sophisticated AI writing tool. Which, in the current technological moment, is almost anyone. This creates an investigative landscape of extraordinary difficulty. When a ransom note arrives, investigators can no longer simply analyze the text and draw confident conclusions about whether a particular person wrote it. They must now determine whether the text was written by a human at all, and if so, whether AI was used to polish or disguise the original voice. This adds time, specialized expertise, and uncertainty to every analysis. And in a kidnapping investigation involving an 84-year-old woman with serious health conditions, time is precisely what investigators do not have in abundance. The proof of life problem compounds everything else. In a traditional kidnapping, the pathway to negotiation runs through verification. The family demands proof that their loved one is alive. The kidnapper provides something, a photograph, a voice recording, a video, that confirms the victim's continued survival. This proof establishes good faith on both sides and creates the conditions under which ransom negotiations can proceed. It is the foundational first step. But technology has made proof of life simultaneously more urgent and more elusive. Deep-fake technology can generate convincing photographs of a person in a location they have never visited. Voice synthesis tools can produce audio recordings that sound exactly like a specific individual saying words that individual never spoke. Video manipulation has advanced to the point where a person can be made to appear alive, lucid, and communicative without any participation from the actual subject. A photograph of Nancy Guthrie holding a current newspaper could be fabricated. A voice recording of her speaking her daughter's name could be generated. A video of her sitting in a room could be constructed from existing footage. Savannah Guthrie acknowledged this reality directly in one of her public appeals. Speaking with the careful precision of someone who had been advised by both attorneys and investigators, she said that the family was ready to talk, but that they lived in a world where voices and images could be easily manipulated. That single sentence communicated the family's impossible position. They wanted proof. They needed proof. But they could no longer simply accept a photograph or a voice recording as proof, because the technology exists to fabricate both with convincing fidelity. Federal investigators do have tools to authenticate digital evidence. Digital forensics laboratories can examine metadata embedded in images and videos, location data, timestamps, device signatures, that may reveal inconsistencies between what a file appears to show and what the underlying data actually records. Pixel analysis can sometimes detect the artifacts of digital manipulation. Spectral analysis of audio files can identify the markers of synthesis rather than organic recording. These tools are effective, but they require time. Time to receive the evidence. Time to analyze it. Time to reach conclusions. And in a case where the victim is elderly, medicated, and has been missing for weeks, every day of analysis is a day that matters. The broader investigative landscape in the Guthrie case is one of layered complexity that veteran law enforcement officials have described as unusual even by the standards of high-profile kidnapping investigations. The combination of factors, a victim with significant health vulnerabilities, a family with extraordinary public visibility, a ransom communication strategy that bypassed the family entirely in favor of media outlets, and the consistent refusal to provide proof of life despite multiple deadlines, does not match established patterns. Experienced hostage negotiators and former FBI officials who have commented publicly on the case have noted that kidnappers who are serious about obtaining payment understand that proof of life is not optional. It is the minimum requirement for any negotiation to begin. Without it, there is no transaction. Without it, the family has no reason to pay and no way to justify doing so. The persistent absence of credible proof of life is either a sign of profound tactical incompetence or evidence that something about this case is fundamentally different from a standard kidnapping for ransom. What that difference might be, investigators have not disclosed. The FBI's public statements have been carefully calibrated to confirm that the investigation is active and serious without revealing information that could compromise it or provide a roadmap for interference. Sheriff Chris Nanos of Pima County, whose department has been coordinating with federal investigators, has echoed this approach, acknowledging the complexity of the investigation and the volume of resources being devoted to it without offering specifics that might be exploited. Meanwhile, the tips continued to arrive in numbers that challenged the capacity of the investigative team to process them. By the time several weeks had passed since Nancy's disappearance, the total had exceeded 40,000. 40,000 individual pieces of information, each one requiring some level of review, each one carrying the theoretical possibility of being the lead that breaks the case open. The statistical reality is that the overwhelming majority of these tips are not useful. They are the product of public concern, media attention, and the human desire to help, sincere but insufficient. A smaller number are actively misleading, submitted by people attempting to direct the investigation away from what actually happened or towards someone they have a personal reason to implicate. And then there are the tips from people like Kella, people who have decided that someone else's catastrophe is an opportunity they cannot pass up. What makes the Kella case particularly instructive is not the arrest itself, though that was satisfying in the way that any successful consequence for cynical exploitation tends to be. What makes it instructive is the speed. 9 seconds. That is the duration of the call that brought federal agents to Kella's door in Torrance. 9 seconds. The call had barely connected before investigators had already begun the process of tracing it. By the following morning, the trace was complete. By the end of the week, Kella was charged. The efficiency of this response is not coincidental. It is the product of a massive investigative infrastructure devoted specifically to this case, an infrastructure designed not only to find Nancy Guthrie but to intercept, trace, and prosecute anyone who attempts to obstruct, exploit, or interfere with that search. The message sent by Kella's rapid arrest is directed not just at opportunists like himself but at the genuine perpetrator, whoever that turns out to be. Every communication carries risk. Every call leaves a record. Every text generates metadata. Every email has an origin that can be pursued through legal channels. The anonymity that digital communication seems to promise is conditional. Conditional on law enforcement not having a reason to look, not having the legal authority to compel disclosure, and not having the resources to pursue the trail. In this investigation, all three of those conditions have been met in the opposite direction. Law enforcement has every reason to look, has secured the authority it needs, and has committed enormous resources to the pursuit. Anyone who communicates with this family, with these media outlets, with anyone connected to this investigation, is taking a risk that they may not fully appreciate until federal agents appear at their door. Whether that message reaches the person who actually took Nancy Guthrie, if indeed she was taken, is another question entirely. Rational actors respond to deterrence. People who calculate risk and weigh consequences against potential rewards adjust their behavior when the cost-benefit analysis shifts against them. But investigations of this nature do not always involve rational actors. They sometimes involve people driven by desperation, by compulsion, by psychology that defies the logic of deterrence. A person who has committed a serious federal crime and is holding an elderly woman may not be thinking clearly about the risks of making a phone call. They may be thinking about money, or about escape, or about problems they created that they do not know how to solve. And thinking about those things, they may make the mistake that investigators are waiting for. The trace that led to Derek Kella was a dead end in terms of finding Nancy. But the infrastructure that produced that trace, the monitoring capability, the legal authority, the forensic expertise, the coordination between agencies across jurisdictions, all of that remains in place and fully operational. The next communication, whatever form it takes, will enter the same system. It will be received, flagged, analyzed, and if it comes from a traceable source, that source will be identified. Investigators will be at the door before the caller has time to wonder whether they made a mistake. Somewhere, Nancy Guthrie is either alive or she is not. Investigators are working as though she is, because that is both the hope they carry and the operational posture that gives their work its urgency. Every ransom note is analyzed for signs of authenticity. Every tip is reviewed for credibility. Every communication is traced to its source. Every lead is followed until it either produces a result or is eliminated from consideration. This is the machinery of a federal investigation at full capacity, pointed at a single objective, sustained by the determination of agents who understand what is at stake. The 9-second phone call from a man in California who wanted to see if a grieving family would respond cost him his freedom and cost investigators dozens of hours of work that could have been used elsewhere. It was a waste. A selfish, pointless, damaging waste. But it also demonstrated something important about the capabilities that exist in this investigation, capabilities that remain ready and waiting for the communication that actually matters. If you have information about Nancy Guthrie's whereabouts or about the circumstances of her disappearance, investigators are asking for your help. The Pima County Sheriff's Department and the FBI both have active tip lines. A reward of $100,000 offered by federal authorities, and an additional $1 million offered by the Guthrie family, remains unclaimed. Anonymity is available to those who need it. The investigation is ongoing. And somewhere, in the middle of all of this, the notes and the traces and the hoaxes and the forensic analysis and the tens of thousands of tips, a family is waiting for their mother to come home.